Hi, I'm Russ Castronovo, author of Beautiful Democracy, and we're here today to have a conversation with Chris Castiglia about his new book, Interior States.
Hi, I'm Dana Nelson, and I'm author of Bad for Democracy, and I'm also co-editor with Russ of a book called Materializing Democracy. And so to launch this, one of the questions that Russ and I ask in the introduction to Materializing Democracy has to do with the many different ways that people tend to define that term. It's a very plastic concept, and in a certain way it's kind of been hollowed out, so we say democracy and we all imagine we're meaning the same thing, and that's not always necessarily true. So I'm curious for you to just talk a little bit about how you're mobilizing the concept of democracy and how that particular term is filled with meaning for you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I mean, I feel like I've learned so much about democracy from both of you, so I can just ask you to say. But sort of what I've pieced together where in the book, what I argue is democracy is a mode of self-empowerment. So rather than, this is what I've learned from your work, Dana, rather than thinking about it in terms of representative politics, thinking about democracy as a mode in which people come together but I guess what I think it's important to emphasize is that it's also about enhancing skills that we already have, enhancing skills of negotiation across difference, rather than thinking about democracy as something that can only happen in the context of comfort or sameness, thinking about how we make democracy with people who are different, how do we make democracies across cultural difference, because that's the important skill of democracy. And then the second part of it is enhancing the powers of creativity, to think about democracy not just as a way of fixing what is, but as a mode of imagining what could be, and trying to imagine a different construction of the social that would be more just and more pleasurable for the people who are living in it. So I think about democracy a lot in the same way that I think about socialism and sociability, right? That people have to be there proximate with each other, so that there can be conversation between them, that it takes account of physical attribute as well, things like affect and body language, but that, ultimately it's about kind of debating and redefining the questions of humanism, right? What does it mean to talk about social?
So you say, I love the idea that you position democracy as a site of sociability, but at the same time I'm holding your new book in my hand, and I see this title, Interior States, which from one's perspective could be kind of seen as an insular location, right? I'm only thinking in my head.
Right.
So how does Interior States link up with that kind of desirable sociability that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that part of what I argue in the book is that we've been encouraged to misunderstand democratic relations as something that happens in our consciousness. So in negotiating between appetite and restraint, or the superego and the id, that these forms of negotiation that we think of as intrinsically interior are in fact happening in the language and using the skills that we should be using to negotiate social relations. And so part of what I'm encouraging is for people to rethink democracy not in relation to kind of producing interior comfort, states of comfort, because that will never happen. Because we live in like capitalism, we're meant to be in a constant state of agitation, but trying to think about how we can use those skills that we've developed interiorly to think about our relations to others.
What have you learned about the Antebellum United States that is useful or applicable or different from our contemporary moment? Do we have interior states for democracy today?
Yeah, we certainly do. I mean, one thing that was striking in the recent vice presidential debate is, as wide as the divisions between Sarah Palin and Joe Biden are, for instance, the one thing they could agree on is neither believed in gay marriage. And that's part of the question that I take up is why do we believe that we can protect what are perceived as national institutions like marriage, right, as a way of shoring up political dissent, or protecting the nation against political dissent. And so we've been made to associate our emotional states with these national institutions that can be deployed to keep people from really thinking about what holds them together, what actually threatens citizens of the nation. You know, the economy can collapse, but thank God gays can't marry, we're safe. You know, these kinds of absurd arguments that substitute institutional protection for thinking about what our actual interests in democratic life is.
So in the conclusion to your book, you talk about a post-interior model of democratic association. And that is a really intriguing and provocative discussion. But I think just my invoking those terms won't give people any kind of understanding of what you're actually proposing. So could you talk a little bit about what you're loading into that idea of a post-interior identity?
Yeah. I'm thinking about how we could have discussions that don't end when people say, well, that's just how I feel. Or, well, that your ideas just make me uncomfortable. Or you don't know who I am inside. That these appeals to interiority, to interior states, become ways of shutting down deliberation. So if we could move from those kinds of appeals to more explicit modes of rational deliberation, then we could say, you hold a position, I hold a position, and we'll talk between us until we can find some, I don't know, some mode of agreement, not necessarily...
Would you say that's the same as the phrase I heard in the debates, well, we're just going to have to agree that we disagree on this?
No, we have to go on disagreeing. I mean, the disagreement is crucial to it.
Okay.
And it's that idea. I mean, the worst
So disagreeing
form of
can't be a stopping point. It has to be a starting point.
It's a starting point, yeah. And the worst of the interior states is comfort, right? And this belief that we have now. I mean, we see this in the classroom. We see this in the culture. That if you're making people uncomfortable, you're doing something anti-democratic. When in fact, I think that may be the moment of starting a democratic conversation, precisely at the moment when people are made uncomfortable and therefore have to step out of the already.
To just talk a little bit more about why we have to get over interiority, and what you mean by that. Because I think most people, when I first asked you about democracy, you said that democracy is a form of self-reliance. And self-reliance, we really think in the terms of interiority, right? I mean, those Emersonian terms of being true to your own self. So why is that a bad thing, and why do we need to get beyond that?
It's not being true to yourself that's a bad thing. It's what you constitute as yourself, right? So what you constitute as yourself could be your brain, right? Your rational construction of justice, right? And the reason that interiority becomes a problem is because it's the modes of sentimentalism that construct so much of our emotional life that invites us toward imperatives to consensus or agreement or comfort or any of these things. And it makes it hard to articulate hard positions because of the threat hard positions pose to these ideas of comfort or agreement or consensus. So that's part of why I think moving away from a kind of interior state would be desirable.
So Chris, how do you know when you're having a post-interior conversation? Are we having one now?